Hello, and welcome to Social 100. This is the first of our weekly virtual lectures. I'm just going to go through some and get you prepared for discussion on Thursday. So we're going to start out talking about some theories and theorists that are foundational to social science research. In particular, we're going to talk about the three theoretical perspectives that are sort of the foundations of sociological thinking. And those are conflict theory, functionalism, and symbolic interaction. We connect those three theories with three old white men that we talk about as the founding fathers of sociology, though American sociology also includes W.E.B. Du Bois and many other sociologists of color out of the Atlanta School of Sociology at Atlanta University. So, conflict theory is the first one that we will start with, and that is associated with Karl Marx. You probably have heard Karl Marx's name. He was a communist, and ideas about communism have been used a lot in the last few years as political propaganda and fear mongering, right? But what Marx was mostly interested in is how workers are alienated from the work they do, in that because they have no sort of direct links to the goods or services that they're providing, just as the employees, they are mostly concerned about how much money they can make and how much money they can make in as little time, working time as possible. I mean, we all looking for that in real life. For Marx, because the proletariat and the bourgeoisie want different things, right? The proletariat, the business owner, the employer wants to make a profit, and the way that you do that is by paying your workers as little as possible and having them work as long as possible. Then their desires would always be at odds with the proletariat, who, as we said earlier, wants to work as little as possible for as much money. Conflict theorists in sociological thinking take those ideas and they apply them to the study of social life. So they think about understanding social interaction as we study it in sociology as being sort of um, founded in this perpetual conflict, economic, social conflict between the haves and the have nots, the worker and the proletariat, the rich and the poor. Okay, now we're going to move on to functionalism. Functionalism is a theoretical perspective that's really interested in social balance, right? Where do people's roles fit in a way that creates this harmony across society, right? Where you have people who work at McDonald's and people who run Apple and design iPhones. And all of those people are important to the day-to-day smooth functioning of a particular society. Well, Emile Durkheim, French sociologist from the 1800s, was really interested in how society functioned and how people acted as a result of that functioning. So he was interested in the division of labor and also did some research on suicide, where he was trying to take the concept of suicide and move it beyond this sort of very individualistic understanding of an act or behavior and expand it to how well integrated into or regulated by society an individual was. And then lastly, our third theoretical perspective is symbolic interaction. Symbolic interaction is really the idea that all of social life and social interaction is based on a complex combination of symbols. And it is how well you understand these symbols and your knowledge of their meanings that solidify your um, position in a particular community or society. Max Weber, another German sociologist, was really interested in sort of meaning making as it relates to social status and power and class. And so social scientists who use symbolic interaction as social social scientists who use symbolic interactionism today are interested in taking Weber's idea of symbols around status and class and power and wealth and expanding that out into all other social interactions. How do symbols help us or hinder our interactions with people on a larger scale? Okay, let's move on to methods because methods help us decide how to study the particular social phenomenon that we are interested in the social sciences, we use methods like surveys, experiments, content analysis, participant observation, which we call ethnography in the social sciences, and interviews, and much, much more. The interesting thing about sociology in particular is that because we still study the social world, the methods are always evolving and changing and innovating. Those five that I just talked about are very sort of foundational and traditional to the discipline, but the types of methods that you could undergo to study social life are really infinite. Okay, let's talk about surveys for a little bit because surveys are often the method, the go-to method for college students. They'll come to me and they'll say, Dr. Harris, I want to do a research project and I want to do surveys. And that's often because we believe surveys to be the easiest thing. You come up with some questions, you type them out, you email them to people, or you print them out on a piece of paper and you give people that survey, and then you collect the data. And generally, that is how it works, except you have to consider that when you are creating a survey, you are writing questions and you have no control over how the participant will perceive the question that you've written. So it actually is quite a lot of work to come up with a set of questions that are each individually well worded and also work together in a way that explicitly helps you answer the research question that you're asking. And that leaves very little room for variation in perspective of how to answer the question across your participants. You want that to be a very even thing. And so that's writing a good survey is difficult. Writing any old survey, you could do that pretty quickly. Now I'm going to show you a quick video about the biggest survey in the United States, and that is the US Census. I'm sure that you know that it's 2020, and so we are collecting census data again. And I want you to pay attention to how and why this data is collected. Enjoy.
What the census is.
Can you explain this to me?
It happens every 10 years and affects every person in the US. Anything?
This is really hard to follow.
It actually impacts your life in a pretty big way. What's up, guys? It's Lawrence from NBC News. So, what is the census and why do we make such a big deal about it every decade? Okay, so first, the obvious question here. What's a census? It's essentially a head count of a group of people and a form of basic record keeping. And here in the United States, the founding fathers actually wrote the need for a census right into the Constitution. It's right here in Article 1, Section 2. Every 10 years, the government's gonna count up every single person living in America. The first census was in 1790 when George Washington was president. Back then, the population was just under 4 million people. And marshals actually rode around on horseback counting everybody up. In 2010, the census recorded around 309 million people living in America. So yeah, horses aren't cutting it anymore. That huge undertaking is done by mail, in person, and for the first time ever, in 2020, online. It's kind of wild to think about. We hardly ever hear about this whole census thing until it's time for the next one every 10 years. But it's super important because it's what the framers of the Constitution chose to be the basis for how we determine political power in the US. They chose population over things like wealth and land ownership. So obviously we've got Congress. There's the Senate, which we all know is made up of 100 senators, 2 from each state, 50 50 times 2? Yeah, you got it. But over in the House, we've got 435 representatives. And can you guess how we figure out how many each state gets? The census, you got it. So every 10 years, Congress gets a shakeup based on the latest data. For example, some experts say after the 2020 census, we could see states like Florida, Texas, and Colorado pick up a few more reps, while some other states lose some. That's all because of how people are moving throughout the decade. It also means that this national headcount is used to draw up new congressional districts. Of course, that's a highly debated topic, which we could make a whole other show on by itself, but if you want that, hit us with a comment. From a money perspective, the federal government also uses all this data to figure out how to hand out billions and billions of dollars in funding to state and local governments. That money funds schools, senior programs, you name it. So for something that literally rolls around just once every 10 years, it's got an impact on us all, like every single day. The census is now the largest peacetime mobilization effort in America. The only thing we put more effort into is basically going off to war. Okay, so by now, I think you're getting just how big of a deal this is, right? But you also gotta be wondering how they pull this off. Here's how it works. Every single place in the US fits into a region, division, block, and tract. There's 4 regions and 9 divisions. Inside all of that, of course, there's the states. Then, even smaller yet, are the census blocks and tracts. Both help break up cities and towns. A tract is what's basically described as a neighborhood group and is made up of a few thousand people. A block is the smallest of them all. It's typically defined in a city by a physical block, but in other places, a small river or train tracks might separate blocks. In all, the US is divided up into more than 11 million of these blocks. Now, to count up everyone in all those blocks takes some serious effort. So every 10 years, right around February, March-ish, a census form is distributed to every single household in America. Once you get it, you fill it out and you're good. And yes, it's actually required by law to participate. You can get hit with a huge fine if you don't. Then by early summer, hundreds of thousands of census workers are tasked with tracking down people who still haven't filled it out. And finally, everything's counted up. We get to see all the results after the final count is presented to the president right before the end of the census year. Okay, so the next census is 2020, and then another 10 years after that brings us to 2030. By then, they might have to figure out how to count Americans living on the moon or something like that. But for 2020, there's a ton of people worried about that census too, to say the least. For starters, it's the first census ever where most Americans are gonna be counted over the internet. But that's got some people upset in rural locations who don't have the best access to the internet. Then there's the questions. There's 7 in all. Age, race, relationship status, sex, Hispanic origin, renter, or owner. And then there was a proposed question about citizenship status. That's the really controversial one. President Trump's administration was trying to put it back on the census for the first time in decades by saying they need that information to better enforce voting rules. But critics said that it was going to discourage a bunch of people from even responding, which goes against the whole point of the census. So ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled to keep it off in 2020. Okay, so that's the census. I guess we'll have this conversation again in 10 years.
Call me in 10 years.
Guys, let's make this a thing. Luckily, you don't have to wait 10 more years. Just stay tuned to keep finding out about more cool stuff like this. Go ahead and click that subscribe button.
Okay, I hope that you enjoyed that video. Now let's talk a little bit about experiments. Experiments in the social sciences are a little bit more difficult because, one, it's difficult to create controlled environments, lab-like environments that you need for experimental research when you're studying real people living and breathing in the social world. And two, because experiments are mostly focused on causal relationships, so the change in one variable causes a change in another variable, and social science research is often much more correlational in the types of research that it does. It can be a bit more difficult to create an experiment that works well for the research question that you have created. There are some very famous social science experiments. They're in part famous because of their sort of questionable ethical protocol, and also because they helped us understand something about social life that we didn't already know. So now I'm going to show you a short video on the Milgram obedience to authority experiment. Enjoy.
Had also looked at how we respond to authority.
In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, eh? I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Okay, let's keep going and talk about how you design a research project. So, in the social sciences, much like the natural sciences, actually, we tend to use a deductive research process where you start with a topic or idea that you're interested in, then you move to exploring the existing literature on that topic to figure out which questions still need to be answered, what topics in this sort of umbrella, broader topic still need to be studied. And then you, as the researcher, come up with one, two, four, maybe depending on the size of your research project, specific research questions that are addressing one facet of social life as it relates to the sort of topic idea that you started with. Then you come up with your research design. So, what method are you going to use and why are you choosing that method? What sample of people are you going to try to collect data from and why are you using that sample of people? When, why, where? All of those questions need to be answered as you put together the sort of explicit step by step design and process of your particular research project. Then you do the fun part. You go out and you collect the data. That could take a couple of weeks. It could take a couple of years, depending on the kind of project that you're doing. But once you have collected the data, and in some cases, as you're collecting the data, you start to analyze it. In the social sciences, when we talk about analyzing data, what we're talking about is looking for patterns. Where do you see similar perceptions? Where do you see similar behaviors, similar thought process, similar emotions, similar lived experiences? And what does that tell us about the research questions that you posed earlier? Once you make those connections to the original research questions, then you can develop these robust conclusions that are sometimes social justice focused, activist focused, sometimes they're about policy change, sometimes they're just summarizing the inferential or descriptive data that you have collected to answer this question. And then cross your fingers, somebody wants to read it and you can get it published. Some things to consider as you are designing research projects. First are variables, right? We tend to deal in three types of variables: independent, dependent, and control variables. Independent variables are those variables that don't depend on any other variables to, to change or to shift. Dependent variables, by comparison, are usually at the center of our particular research, and they are the variables whose change we're trying to understand. So what kind of change takes place in the dependent variable when you add different types of independent variables into the mix? And then lastly, control variables. What facet of the data collection population or setting or whatever it might be are you holding fast, where every person who is participating in the data has the same identity or connection to this particular variable. The other thing that you want to consider is operationalization, which is really a fancy scientific way of saying definition. So, concepts like abuse or illness, those are sort of very general topics that we are concerned about in the social sciences, but how we define them is explicitly connected to the research questions that we have created. So as social scientists, once we put together a research project, we want to also be very clear and explicit about how we are using these concepts exclusive to the project itself. And then lastly, what I like to call the three wise men: validity, reliability, and generalizability. Validity is the extent to which your research question and the method that you've chosen work well together. Those 5 traditional research methods that I gave you earlier do not necessarily work interchangeably with any research question that you were to come up with. And so being sure that you have picked a method that can help you answer the question that you're posing as part of your research design is really important. Next is reliability. In the social sciences, just as in the natural sciences, we are trying to make sure that we are undergoing the scientific method in such a way that if another scientist were to come behind us and execute our research design exactly as we did, that they would likely find the same thing. And that is really important to ensuring that you have an appropriate research design for the questions that you have created. So that's the second wise man. The third wise man, he's wise, but you don't always need to have him around, and that's generalizability. Sometimes we want to study a small group of people so that we can say something about everybody who is a member of that particular group. And in order to do so, we have to design our project in such a way that the sample is reflective of that population that we're trying to generalize to, and that the method of data collection allows us to generalize out to that broader population. If you were doing more small scale research that was confined to a particular setting, or if you were doing case study research, you might not care as much about generalizability, but it is one that we often consider as part of the research design. Okay, the last thing that we really, and maybe most importantly, need to care about as social science researchers is ethics. And to me, it's more important in the social sciences than even in the natural sciences that we care about ethics, because we're dealing not just with human beings, but in their sort of day-to-day lives. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment is one in which social science research was undergone in a way that harmed the population that it was studying. And when we talk about ethics, what we're talking about is doing no harm: no physical harm, no mental harm, no emotional or psychological harm. I'm going to show you now a quick video to tell you a little bit more about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and think about why we might consider this project unethical today. Okay, enjoy.
What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
We have no idea how many wives, girlfriends, children inherited the disease and also died or were forever crippled by its effects.
For 40 years, the U.S. government operated public health service conducted what was known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, one of the darkest chapters in American history. Now, over 40 years after the study ended, we still don't know, and might never know, the full extent of its effects. And the study might have continued if not for a 1972 article from Associated Press reporter Jean Heller.
Everyone who knew about this, to my way of thinking, everyone who knew about this and didn't blow the whistle, that didn't shout to high heaven, "This is wrong," is culpable.
Syphilis was considered a national health crisis in the early 20th century.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you've got it.
And many doctors at the time thought syphilis and other medical complications were affected by race. To study the disease, researchers found a population of poor, black, syphilitic sharecroppers in and around Tuskegee, Alabama during the Great Depression. Nearly 400 of the participants had syphilis, while another 200, the control group, did not. In the end, as many as 100 men died from complications related to untreated syphilis, and the message was very clear. Black deaths mattered.
Medical doctors deliberately let them die, wanted them to die for what they could discover from their bodies later.
How old were you when you first learned about the Tuskegee study?
23.
The day you published this story, the day the story was published, did you know what was getting ready to happen?
Yeah. I knew it would be explosive. After the story broke, and there was this incredible public outcry, Senator Kennedy had held very, very public congressional hearings on this.
If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared.
The study and the aftermath are well documented in films and books, but there are still things we might never know, and for Heller, that goes back to the very beginning.
I still have not heard the answer to the very simple question of why. They should have been able to determine after the first 3 or 4 autopsies that the inside of a black person ravaged by syphilis looks identical to the insides of a white person, and stop the study.
Beyond that, Heller believes there's no way to know just how many people were directly or adjacently affected by the study or its disclosure. Survivors, victims of the study, and their families did win a $10 million settlement from the US government, and the study's disclosure led to modern medical ethics procedures. But Heller says more than 40 years later, there's still at least one lesson to be learned from the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Those of us who recognize that this country has got so far to go, never quit fighting. Never quit standing up and yelling. I don't care if you're LGBT, I don't care if you're black, I don't care if you're disabled. You need advocates. You need people who can move the world.
Okay, at the end of each video, I'm going to leave you guys with an active learning exercise to help solidify all of the information that I provided for you today. So today's active learning exercise, I provide the topic, you design the study. So the topic is, what is the relationship between the type of university or college and their COVID-19 protocol for the semester fall 2020. So you will choose the research question, you'll pick the variables, you'll pick the method, and you'll pick the sample. And we will talk about some of your answers when we meet on Thursday. Bye.